Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are so excited to have everybody join our very first webinar in our Unshame California Learning webinar series. We are also really excited to have Dr. Corrie Vilsaint with us today, talking about the power of non-stigmatizing language and person-first language. As we go through, please feel free to add any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will have some time at the end to ask those questions. Before we do get started, I just want to go over really quickly on some updates on the campaign and what we've been working on. Officially, we have been launched for about a month now. So in that time, as most of you have heard, we are working on a 10-month evidence-based campaign throughout the state. We are funded by the Department of Healthcare Services, DHCS. And although our campaign officially launched in March, we have been working on research and doing interviews and getting everything together since July. We are really excited that we've started to release some of our stories, and pretty soon you will be seeing way more stories as we start to put those out on our social media pages and website. We have had 34 partners sign up with us, and these are organizations from across the state, including treatment centers, healthcare providers, educational institutions, coalitions, and nonprofit organizations. So we're really excited to keep adding more partners throughout our campaign. We also completed 18 needs assessments. It's actually community needs assessments that we completed, but there are 18 of them that we did from across the state. And we are working on hopefully putting together a report for everyone to share some of the high-level findings that we heard from people when we did these interviews. And then lastly, we have completed 5 stories we've collected. And like I mentioned, we will be sharing all of these throughout the next couple of months on our social media pages. We've been working to make sure that we really perfect the way that we're sharing these stories and are getting at the heart of what people are really wanting to say in them. So we're really excited to share what we've been working on. If you aren't already following us, Unshame California and Somos Unshame California for Spanish, we are on both Instagram and Facebook. Our digital team has really been working on, figuring out what messages, what images, and what ads are going to be working and going to be the most impactful for people. So we're really excited to be kicking this off. As you may have seen, if you already follow, we already have a bunch of content up. Feel free to share and repost both through your own accounts and through your organization accounts. We do follow most of our partners, all of our partners who have social media. So if we don't, feel free to either send me an email, send us a DM, and we will definitely add you to the list. Later this month, we'll also be launching our influencer program. So pretty soon you'll be seeing some of our partnership with influencers across Instagram and Facebook, as well as potentially TikTok for people that have that as well. And lastly, if you do know someone who wants to share their story, maybe it's you as a person that works in the space, we'd love to have a conversation about what that looks like. You can email us at unshamecalifornia@shatterproof.org. Go on our website. There's a link there as well. Or always feel free to email me and I can connect you to the right person. And lastly, before we get started here, just a bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and made available on our website. Like I mentioned, please use our Q&A throughout to ask any questions that you have. And then lastly, we do have Spanish interpreters available. So if you do need that, there is an interpretation button at the bottom. You can click that and you should be able to hear everything in Spanish. And lastly, as always, like I mentioned, feel free to email me. I love hearing from people, lalfaro@shatterproof.org. So with that, let me just stop sharing here. We are really excited to be, like I mentioned, have our illustrious guest speaker today, Dr. Corrie Vilsaint. She is the Associate Director of Recovery Health Equity at the Recovery Research Institute and Center for Addiction Medicine, and also an instructor at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. As a community psychologist and nationally recognized speaker, her research focuses on racial health equity and remission and recovery, reducing recovery-related discrimination, and building recovery capital and the effectiveness of recovery support systems. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Corrie today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Very kind introduction. And welcome to everybody who is joining us here today. I am excited and honored to be able to share this time with you. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. All right. So let's go ahead and start this campaign. Let's unshame California, right? Stigma, shame, they create barriers to the transformation that lies on the other side of a substance use disorder, which is recovery. Recovery for individuals, recoveries for families, friends, community level recovery. Shame and stigma are reflected in the systems that we design to service our communities and the interpersonal narratives and explanations we tell ourselves and others. And, America has crossed a very grim milestone of over 192 overdose deaths per day. And the rate among Black Americans overtook that of white Americans in the year 2020 for the first time since 1999. So as a result, today people are more likely to die from accidental opioid drug poisoning than in car crashes. People's perception of this disorder will influence their willingness to support efforts to save lives. As a result, we've gathered here today. We're going to interrogate some of the frameworks that we rely upon and challenge some of the narratives that we've inherited. And doing so, we're going to move one step closer to unshaming California. We'll cover a couple types of objectives today. I want to start by taking a look at sources that both reflect and affect stigma around substance use disorders. I would like you to become a little more well-versed in describing the role of race in shaping stigma and policy around these disorders. And we are going to look at some tools of stigma elimination in terms of the medicalization, the recovery movement, language, and we're going to change the narrative about recovery. And we're going to start talking about what people are doing in their recovery. Let's just kind of get on the same page to start with regarding stigma. And let's think of it in terms of an attribute, a behavior, or a condition that's socially discrediting. Okay, so my goodness, how did we get here? Addiction may be the most stigmatized condition in the US and around the world. Well, here, this was a study that looked across 14 countries and 18 of the most stigmatized conditions. And the results of this was that drug addiction was the #1 ranked most stigmatized condition, and alcohol addiction came in 4th. That was higher than being a criminal. That was higher than testing positive for HIV. We may literally be dealing with the most stigmatized condition, one of the most stigmatized conditions in the world. Research indicates that stigma is rooted in the belief that addiction is a personal choice, reflecting a lack of willpower or a moral failing. And we're going to look a little deeper into that and challenge that assumption that can occur, particularly with the most severe substance use disorders. Now, let's start with healthcare. Okay, historically, healthcare, this is a source that both we can see reflects and affects stigma. Substance use disorders were traditionally separate from general health care and even mental health care at times. In fact, it was Alcoholics Anonymous that when it was founded in the early 1900s, because providers did not attend to substance use disorders. Even in the 70s, addiction was viewed as a social problem. It was dealt with through civil and criminal justice. And existing healthcare systems, they were not trained or particularly cared or eager to accept patients with substance use disorders. And so this kind of reinforced the notion that substance use disorder was different from other medical conditions, and healthcare failed to recognize substance use disorder related health conditions. This created unintended and enduring impediments to the quality of care. A little experiment here that sometimes we like to run. See if you can correctly identify the pictures or facilities that treat substance use disorders versus other health conditions. Most people are able to tell which are which because, on average, not all the time, but the quality of the physical environment and that people with substance use disorder and maybe even mental health are treated tend to have a much lower standard. However, people with substance use disorders may need a better quality of environment because they tend to have sometimes lost the self-respect or the dignity of being a human as a result of addiction. And so people with substance use disorders often were getting treated in second-class environments because, quote unquote, it's good enough for an addict, or quote unquote, it's not a real disorder, and therefore we can appropriate less funding. And that's an example of discrimination in healthcare. Additionally, language absolutely reflects and affects stigma. As a result of that very siloed healthcare, the way this developed historically, we also developed a language that was very different from other medical conditions, which explains why sometimes we have less formalized medical language. You hear things like having a clean or a dirty urine test as opposed to a positive or negative. I hear practitioners sometimes say that a patient can't be trusted, as opposed to saying that a patient is symptomatic or experiencing recurrence abuse. We have a very moralistic language around this condition as opposed to in this profession, which reinforces stigma. For example, people with eating related conditions are often referred to as having an eating disorder, but you almost never hear them called food abusers, right? So then why over here in this health condition are we did we call people substance abusers as opposed to having a substance use disorder, right? And so you can see that our language reflects this stigma. The media affects and reflects stigma as well around substance use disorders. In fact, when an author from Vanity Fair contacted me to get my opinion on that show on A&E's Intervention, they were explaining it's coming back, a highly popular show. I've certainly seen it a number of times. But what they wanted to know about it really had to do with stigma. And I told them, in this case, which other medical condition have we normalized the use of public media exposure during a vulnerable and a symptomatic time period as a coercion tool to gain consent prior to treatment? Those are the types of comparison of things that we need to be thinking about. And I think that in part why we have seen that is because of the stigma of this disorder. But, again, people's perception will affect their willingness to help. It is not unusual to see stigma reflected in our policy, and any conversation around policy and substance use disorders would not be justified, and I would not retain my credibility if I did not also talk about the stigma towards people of color as well. In fact, looking back at our policy, racism infused our drug policy. You have to think that there was a time when all drugs were legal before they were illegal. And so why were some drugs chosen to be illegal? And it's not necessarily based upon pure scientific assessment of the risk and benefits of these drugs, but it had to do with who was perceived to be associated with these drugs. So illegal drug use was perceived to be associated with socially and economically disadvantaged people, many of whom were immigrants. And early drug laws were initiated as a form of prejudice against immigrants. 1870s, that's when the anti-opium laws were directed at Chinese immigrants. 1910s and 20s, anti-marijuana laws directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans. Our policies, when in the 1970s, when Nixon declared a war on drugs, the language, public enemy, number one is drug abuse. It's declaring war on your own people, right? Now this has since shifted, and we start using, we start talking about public health in terms of public enemy. But again, this was because of the perception, this was the stigma, and that for this particular medical condition, we can lock them up, right? So, and I will absolutely, it is critical that, I apologize for all the text you're about to see, but sometimes you need to read it from, you need to hear it from the horse's mouth, as they say. One of Nixon's top aides gave an important interview in 1994. It's easy to look this up. And he explained what was going on when they set these approaches in motions. We said 1968 and the Nixon White House after that, they had two enemies: the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. As a result, the mechanisms through which they used to infuse that Anti-Drug Abuse Act 1986 created the disparity in the sentencing between crack and cocaine, which was a linchpin of filling the prisons with Black people, no-knock warrants, minimum mandatory sentencings. As a result, we have today approximately 77% of those incarcerated in federal prisons for drug crimes are Black and Latinx. Or Latin, depending on however the words that they choose to adopt these days. I've seen them both. 57% in state prisons. Okay, now this is a result of the stigma toward people of color as well, and so you have to understand how drug policy was formed and the stigma behind it. Now, taking another look at bringing it up to date here with policy, this is kind of like a rip from the headlines type of thing that you're looking here. This it says the analysis of state laws permitting intoxication exclusions in insurance contracts and their enforcement. So alcohol exclusion policies are kind of like a group of policies. Right now, there's about 23 states that I can find. It's a changing thing that allow your health insurance company to deny a claim if you test positive to having an unprescribed drug or alcohol in your system. And one drink's enough to do it, by the way. It's not detailed how much. And again, here it says many plans deny payment. So we know that we are allowed to systematically exclude people in need of health care based upon these reasons. Another issue with policy, again, the headlines here: drug convictions can send financial aid up in smoke. That was absolutely true. That was happening. In fact, drug convictions were one of the few that could send your financial aid for higher education up in smoke. It's kind of counterintuitive to deal with people who are using substances in a way then to in turn make them less educated. That it's counterintuitive public approach. In fact, there has been, since I'm going to show you a study in this policy, there's been some changes to that more recently. But again, policy discrimination. Let's look at, sorry about this. Let me adjust there we go. again, the headlines, more states lift welfare restrictions for drug felons. There was a federal ban that prohibited nutritional assistance to those that were convicted of felony drug crimes for the rest of their lives. I call this discrimination because it did not apply to any other crimes. You could commit robbery, murder, embezzlement, and still retain your eligibility for nutritional assistance. That's why this is discrimination. This comes out of the stigma associated with people who use drugs or people who had a history of using drugs. I'd argue even in their recovery. But these headlines really really spurred my interest in studying this and the effects of this. So we did a study, and it was called the National Recovery Study. And in here, it was at the time, we studied people who resolved a problem with alcohol or other drugs. This was like a one-time survey. We had a huge sampling frame that covered 97% of US households, from which we had a representative subset of 40,000 people were invited. The final sample included about 2,000, and it was balanced on the US Census demographics. Okay, so it was nationally representative. At the time, it was really the first survey of people even asking who identifies as being in recovery. Since then, the federal government has caught on as well and has started doing that. But what I was interested in this case, there was a battery of measures given, but the one that I was interested in is I put in a series of questions because I wanted to know about, I understood that there's levels of discrimination, things that can happen on what you call a micro level, personal slights, insults, derogatory statements that are made. But there's also more structural things that occur at a structural level, things that are baked into the process, right? And they can occur at an organizational level or a policy level. And I asked people, how frequently has the following occurred because somebody knew about your history with alcohol or other drugs? Because everybody in this study had reported resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs, many of which even identified as being in recovery. But that's a social identity. Not everybody chooses to take that, but their pathways and that they had resolved the problem was the same in that identification. And so I wanted to know how frequently people reported some of these things. And so when it comes to the national prevalence amongst people who have resolved a problem with alcohol or other drugs, you can see here that when we look at those micro level aggressions, 46% said people assumed I was likely to relapse. You can see that 38% said they felt like they were being held to a higher standard because people knew about their history, their resolved history with alcohol or other drugs. 35% people said people treated me less favorably. 20% said I look like an alcoholic or an addict. In their recovery, they're still being told this. 28% said I was ignored by people because they knew about my history with alcohol or other drugs. I was disrespected because they knew about my history. Moving along here, about almost 32% said people avoided me because they knew about my history. People assumed I could not provide for myself. 31%. 29% of people who've resolved a problem in this country with alcohol or other drugs said that people accuse me of being honest still in their recovery. 27% saying that they are rejected by family or friends. 25% saying they treated like a criminal. 18% people perceive me as being dangerous. Okay. And if we take a look at the macro level, we'll see here, these are more of the structural things that I explained are kind of baked into the process. Wanted to know if they could be facing these still. Well, you can see here about 15% reported, it has been hard for me to get health insurance because they knew about my problem with alcohol or other drugs. About 13% saying I lost my job because somebody knew about my problem. 11% saying they was denied a loan or didn't even bother to apply. Well, again, we know that not being eligible, for example, financial aid, that was These were legal, right? These were things that were baked into the process. 9% saying they were denied housing because they knew about their resolved history with alcohol or other drugs. 9% saying they are denied access to nutritional assistance. And even 11% saying I left a recovery or an addiction treatment environment due to unfair treatment. Yes, we know that even in treatment environments, people can experience stigma. There's a number of studies that have made us aware of that in hopes of making us as professionals who work in those environments more cognizant of the types of biases we may have. But moving on with these kind of macro level discriminations that people experience, 16% say I was treated unfairly by the police because they knew about my history with alcohol or other drugs. 13% say they received inadequate medical treatment. Again, we know these things were built into the system. They're legal. 10% saying my insurance would not cover some of my medical costs because of my history with alcohol or other drugs. 14% saying I could not get a job, and nearly 8% saying I was denied the right to vote because of my history with alcohol or other drugs. And I will say that voting rights, actually, now that's something that can be affected outside of substance use as well. There's a number of ways that somebody can lose their voting rights, unlike some of the other loss of rights that we saw that were really something very specific to just substance use. Okay. Now, did it matter that people were dealing with this, that people were facing this even after resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs? Well, yes, it did. Because individuals that were exposed to this type of recovery-related discrimination also were experiencing a higher level of psychological distress, lower levels of quality of life, and lower levels of recovery capital, also known as recovery resources or assets. And so, yes, it matters. It does matter. Then, in an interesting follow-up question, I can see that this is affecting people in their recovery, but I also wanted to know, is everybody experiencing these types of discriminations in the same way? So I asked if it was the same by race or ethnicity. And the first thing that I'll point out to you is that I'm starting with the macro level ones, because the micro level aggressions actually did not have any differences. Okay. The other thing I want you to know in this case is that you're looking at over half the sample now, as opposed to the whole sample that reported alcohol as a primary problem. Reason being is because the Research Society on Alcoholism asked me to prepare this for them. So I just want to make note of that technical adjustment that comes here. But one, micro discriminations appeared to be about the same, but the structural, the organizational things, the things that are baked into the process are disproportionately affecting individuals that identified as Black in this case. They were 3 times as likely to report leaving a recovery or addiction environment due to unfair treatment. Well, you can look in the treatment literature and see that individuals that identify as Black are not retained in treatment. So we have corroboration on things like that. Black individuals were twice as likely to say they lost their job because somebody knew about their history with alcohol or other drugs, 3 times as likely as their white counterparts to report that they were denied housing because of their resolved history with alcohol or other drugs, 3 times as likely to say that they could not get a job, and 4 times as likely to say they had a job, but they could not get a promotion. You know, it is critical for us to know that by the year 2055, 2060, there'll be no single racial or ethnic majority in this country. And so we need to anticipate increasing diversity in all of the work we do. These are the types of levers that we can pull to reshape the landscape of recovery. And we need to change the narrative on how our institutions are magnifying harm from disorder rather than minimizing harm and promoting well-being. But let's start to take a look at some of the tools that we have. Let's take a look at the upswing of this, right? Let's change gears a little bit and talk about how stigma has been reduced, and furthermore, the tools we need to harness to bring that into our communities, into our homes, and around the people that will surround us. Well, starting with medicalization. Okay. It was the medicalization movement that helped to reduce stigma by actually, there was a very prominent article here in the year 2000 by somebody who was very high up in running drug policy. And he compared the treatment rates of substance use disorder to other chronic conditions. So as you can see, the rates of relapse were similar to other chronic illnesses. Substance use disorders were compared to hypertension, which is set beside asthma. That was back in the year 2000. That was very significant for us. But at the same time, we'll take a look at the strengths and the weaknesses of that medicalization process. But this was significant in the field, recognizing this as a disorder and thinking about it in terms of other illnesses. Additionally, the recovery movement. The recovery movement has had and continues to have a huge effect on stigma reduction in this field. In fact, it was really reflected, this idea of recovery and the recovery construct. You know, what is this? This as a construct is really becoming more accepted and validated in the scientific, medical, and government communities. You know, historically, we relied upon just the medical field, which used this outcome of remission, okay, which means no longer meeting criteria for substance use disorder for a 1-year period, with the exception of the craving criteria, or the substance use, looking at either abstinence or reductions of use. You know, the thing I say that the common thread here is this focus on abstinence or pathology in people, but however, people with lived experience know that recovery is more than that. Recovery is not just about the absence or reduction of something, it is about the presence of something, the presence of health. It's about the presence of well-being. Okay, and this is how the recovery movement started to almost demedicalize and destigmatize substance use disorders. You can see what will happen is we started to go through a paradigm shift where this field was exclusively focused on pathology. The recovery movement has also added a focus on strengths as well. You can even see it here in the way we look at things in our words, with kind of a pathology focus if you're looking at remission versus if you're talking about recovery, you're talking about resilience, looking at risk factors and only risk factors, but we need to account for protective factors as well. We talk about our deficits as opposed to our assets, what's broken as opposed to what's functioning, pathological behaviors versus the adaptive behaviors. You know, we're breeding powerlessness instead of breeding empowerment, thinking about disease as opposed to health, right? And so there's a paradigm shift. In fact, there's a number of strength-based assessments in terms of our research that we've been using to capture what goes on in recovery. Quality of life is something we routinely use at the Recovery Research Institute where I'm from. The brief assessment of recovery capital. Recovery capital, these are the building materials of recovery that are needed to reconstruct people's lives, their self-esteem. And yes, we care about their happiness. Now, when we did that national recovery study that I told you about, we rolled these metrics out. And I'd like to show you how they look, because we had people that had a range of years of experience since resolving their problem with alcohol or other drugs. And in this graph here, you'll see we show you from starting at the beginning to 40 years since resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs. And all these different lines that start at the bottom and go up, these are those strength-based assessments, okay? And the good news is they're moving in the direction you want. Life gets better, and here's another form of proof over it, because lived experience is a form of proof above itself. But for those of you who are inclined and that who need to see some data, here you go. This is what recovery looks like. Psychological distress, starting high, but moving down, moving lower as time goes on. But I want you to also take a closer look. And so we know, so we can educate ourselves about what is going on in this early time frame. We're looking at, you can see here that when you take a closer up look, a lot of these indicators go down around year 1 before they rebound back up. In other words, we know that people may feel worse 6 months out than they do on day one. But when we know this, we can also prepare for this. We know from a systems level, when we need to drive up services, when we need to narrow in, we know that we can prepare people this and tell them that it is normal, it is common, and absolutely life gets better. We have proof of it. Okay. And so the recovery movement has helped to give us an entire narrative change around what recovery is, and that it's not just necessarily, is it remission alone? Is recovery a negative drug screen? Recovery is more than the presence of the result of a drug screen. And so let's go ahead and move on to the language and the way that we know that language reflects and affects stigma. And I'm going to show you examples from service provision, blame, the perceived likelihood of recovery, and even the need for punishment. And we'll start just by looking at this first study here. This was done by my boss and the founder of the Recovery Research Institute. And he was asking, does it matter how we refer to individuals with substance-related conditions? More specifically, what he did was he ran a test. We use vignettes sometimes that are helpful in uncovering language and the best way to use it. Substance abuser, he gave this to a group of people to read. And he said, Mr. Williams is a substance abuser attending a treatment program through the court. As a part of the program, Mr. Williams is required to remain abstinent from alcohol or other drugs. And then we switch that word out with substance use disorder. And we have a group of people read, Mr. Williams has a substance use disorder. And everything else in the vignette is saying. And what we found is that compared to those with a substance use disorder condition, compared to substance abuser, people agreed with the idea that the individual was more personally culpable and needed more punishment. So that was the effect of just language alone for the same health condition. Well, why is that? Sometimes substance abuser can imply a willful misconduct. Substance use disorder may imply more of a medical condition. It's just this is one example of how language can be a tool of stigma reduction. And in fact, even thinking about invoking, do they need punishment or do they need care, right? And so another study that Dr. Kelly more recently did, what about the ways of describing drug-related impairment? Does it matter the way we describe drug-related impairment? And so we did a terminology study. And this was the list that he wanted to tackle and test. What about if you call it, we're calling drug-related impairment, okay? And we want to find the term that reduces stigma. So we're going to test, again, using a vignette. So people read different scenarios. Chronically relapsing brain disease versus a brain disease versus a disease, an illness, a disorder, a problem. And thousands of people were in this study. It was nationally representative again. And the scenario that they read, Alex was having a serious trouble at home and at work because of their increasing opioid use. They're now in a treatment program where they're learning from staff that their drug use is best understood as and this is where all the groups got tested on all those different terms. That often impacts multiple areas of one's life. Alex is committed to doing what they can to ensure success following treatment. In the meantime, they have been asked by their counselor to think about what they've learned with regard to understanding their opioid use as and that list of terms was varied. So when it comes to the results, I will tell you, life's complicated, okay? There's really not one. What happens is there was not one apparent way. It's one single medical term that can be met with our goals in mind. Meaning, what are the goals? If you look at the top here, we look at stigma or blame attribution. Okay. And on the bottom graph, we're going to take a look at how they performed in terms of people's prognostic optimism, the likelihood of recovery. Well, we see when it comes to reducing blame attribution, chronically relapsing brain disease was the one that reduced stigma in terms of blame attribution the most. That's a very biomedical term, right? However, in terms of increasing the likelihood and understand that people do and can get better from this, that the word problem was the term that had the most optimism associated with it. However, if we wanted to adopt problem, we also see up here, problem was one that had the most stigma in terms of blame attribution. So it's not an easy handoff. And what it tells you, the results of the study tell you, well, maybe you want to think about who you're talking to and what environment. The biomedical term, well, it's a bit of a mouthful. You have to think about who you're talking to. So it's not a straightforward answer in that regard, but it does give us a better understanding of what language increases blame and what language increases the knowledge that people do get better. In fact, we can tell you generally speaking, this is a good prognosis disorder. 60% of people will reach remission. Now, let's take a look at another example from the studies here. This is American Journal of Public Health. And you can see they called it Language Matters in combating the opioid epidemic, safe consumption sites versus overdose prevention sites. So what they did here is taking a look at how this was conducted. There was 2 web-based surveys, thousands of people, and they were presented with 3 facts about opioids and opioid-related overdose deaths. So half were given a definition called a safe consumption site, and then the other half were given the exact same definition, except safe consumption site was changed to overdose prevention site. So everything was the same except what it was called. And then they were asked if they supported the legalization of safe consumption sites or overdose prevention sites, depending on what they got. Here you can see that 45% of them showed support for an overdose prevention site. However, when they were presented with the exact same information, and then except the only difference was it was called a safe consumption site, 29% of them supported legalization of a safe consumption site. So this shows the role that language can play in influencing public support. That's not a modest effect. That's a considerable effect right there. It can influence public support and eventually even policy development. Okay, so the way we talk, the way we write matters, right? Even when we're describing the exact same thing, but 2 different terms. All right, so just a few suggestions to take with you. And I'll also say that NIDA from the NIH offers terminology on their website, but just a few, kind of popular things that what we want to use person-centered language. So instead of kind of calling somebody, it almost feels like you're calling them name, you're an abuser, a person or an individual with a substance use disorder. That's an example of person-centered language, as opposed to alcoholic. A person with an alcohol use disorder might be the terminology that we adopt in the general public or in professional organizations. We want to talk about drug screens in terms of if they are a positive or negative result, not if they were dirty or clean. And we don't want to necessarily call people addicts, again, because that's not person-centered language. And I will say, out of respect for all the many people who have used different 12-step models to support their recovery or to make a change, well, you'll find that sometimes in those models, they're using different language, and what I tell people is, as a professional, though, that doesn't mean that I use that. That was the language that was coming out at a different time and place. It was amongst a group of individuals in a recovery support service, but I am a professional, okay? And, if we're thinking about what our family members, maybe our family members didn't come out of that group. Instead, they're using terminology that came out, that they could be thinking more deeply about. So as a professional or a member of the general public, that doesn't mean that you have to use that terminology, okay? Just because it's helpful for some doesn't mean that we have to adopt it. And so I'll show you a resource then regarding language. At the Recovery Research Institute, we have something called the dictionary online. And so if you go to recoveryanswers.org, you can search for the dictionary. The idea is that if we want addiction destigmatized, we need a language that is unified. And sometimes what we have on there are even kind of, we'll put warnings on there if it's more of a stigmatized language, and explain it a little bit more. In fact, the dictionary has become hugely popular, I must say, at recoveryanswers.org. And if you find that you're able to visit, we are considered one of the biggest repositories outside of resources like PubMed. And we're considered one of the biggest repositories in this field. We are independent. We are a trusted resource in this field. And if you go there, please go ahead and sign up for our monthly bulletin. We have a team of scientists who take those studies on PubMed and rewrite them for the general public. We redo the graphs, we rewrite the language, we summarize them in a way that is useful for family members, practitioners, and policymakers, and we give those direct implications to all of them. So I encourage you as well. That is one of the best ways of keeping up to date with what's going on in the field and keeping your eye on the prize, which is recovery. So I think the last section that I want to cover is, again, just showing you how we can change the narrative around recovery. And we've done this, again, at the Recovery Research Institute. My colleague David Eddy led a study on achievements, right? Let's talk about their lives in the broader context, right? Let's take a look at what is going well as opposed to what is always broken. Let's take a look at assets as opposed to deficits here. And let's change the narrative. And my colleague did an excellent job at doing that when he took up reasons to be cheerful, personal, civic, and economic achievements after resolving an alcohol or drug problem in the United States population. So again, this data came from our National Recovery Study. And in doing so, we wanted to capture what was going on in people's lives since resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs and publish it so that people have another way of talking about and thinking about this incredible recovery movement. And part of what we see here is that you can see that a number of people starting very high, it looks like 16.8% said that they had returned to school since resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs. 13% had completed a technical school or a college degree or a graduate degree. 36% have gotten a new job since resolving their problem with alcohol or other drugs. 15% have received a promotion in their old job. About 3% have actually regained custody of their children since resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs. This is a part of what can happen in life and recovery. Okay, this is the doorways that can open up here. Nearly 34% had helped financially support their family since resolving a problem with alcohol or other drugs. 34% had helped others who were having problems. 21% have done volunteer service in their local community. Nearly 26% have contributed to charities and in their recovery, and 30% have voted in their recovery. 36% said that they have purchased a new car, a form of economic development here in their recovery, and 26% have purchased a home since resolving. In fact, it was about 80% of adults who resolved a problem with alcohol or other drugs reported a significant achievement in one or more of the domains here across self-improvement, family engagement, civic engagement, and economic participation. And so with that being said, we hope to leave people with a way of kind of changing the narrative about what can happen here. So in summary, we started by covering and identifying a number of sources that both reflect and affect stigma around substance use disorders. We understood how historically healthcare was, substance use disorder was siloed out of healthcare, resulting in many language differences as well. We see the way the stigma around this is reflected in the media. We see the way the stigma is reflected in the language that we've adopted. Furthermore, we covered some ground in understanding, if you're going to talk about how policies came to be around alcohol or other drugs and why they are the way they are affecting people with substance use disorder, you have to understand the role of stigma, not only around the substance use disorders itself, but people of color. We're foundational. We're foundational in understanding our drug policies. And then we took a look at a number of tools of stigma elimination, the medicalization of it, comparing relapse rates to other chronic illnesses was helpful in the field. We also looked at the recovery movement, the focus on what is functioning, what is adaptive, the focus on building recovery capital is what our recovery movement brought in, as opposed to a focus on is the drug screen negative, or a focus on remission alone, focus on health, well-being. That's what the recovery movement gave us. Furthermore, we looked at a number of studies that show absolutely does language matter. It matters for service provision. It matters people's perception of blame. It matters for their perceived likelihood of recovery. So our language absolutely matters. And then we took a look at a study that just is going to change the narrative altogether. And we're going to focus on what happens in long-term recovery and changing the narrative about having a history with alcohol or drug use, and showing all the things, just to show all the things that people in recovery do, very similar to what people who have not experienced an alcohol or other drug problem. And we're looking at similar, and you can look at these things, and that's a way of destigmatizing as well. All right. So instead of looking at recovery specific events, we look at events that affect everybody and then ask them, how often is it occurring amongst people in recovery? And that in itself is a way of reducing stigma. So I'll go ahead and stop right there and take a pause. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that. That honestly was amazing. And I always learn so much every time, having conversations with people who dedicate their lives to doing this research. We do have a couple of questions here coming in. First, we have one. Do you have an elevator answer to stigma when confronted by regular folks? So what do you say when you have a minute? Why does stigma matter?
Right. So when I'm confronted with people regarding an elevated answer for, stigma, I think one of the first things that I say, particularly in my group, is that, this is a health condition like any other health condition. And so we're going to approach it with the same bag of tools that we do any other medical condition. And that's often in my crowd and who I find that I'm talking to. That's where I start right off the bat. So when they understand why I'm explaining to them that we need to create access to, perhaps some people need want to use the medication. Well, you need to create access to medication for pregnant and parenting women. Again, and that can be very scary for somebody here. But when I say this is a life-saving medication, it's got overdose prevention, and it's good for the fetus. We want to get them away from the short-acting opioids and control this through exposure to the long-acting opioids. Okay, and so when I explain one, we treat this the way we any other health condition that we do, and two, this is a life-saving approach that we have right here. And it kind of changes the narrative from a punitive one, but they need this to realize, actually, we're here to save lives and we're here to improve the quality of life. And I feel like those are kind of some of the tools that I find that I go to. That's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Another question I've gotten before is, there are people obviously probably here in the audience who fully agree that language is important and stigma is a really big part of substance use. But how do you talk to, say, your coworkers when maybe they're still using language like drug abuser or, clean and dirty? How do you talk to them in a way so that they're not going to immediately shut down?
Yeah. Well, I tend to follow my boss's lead on this because he's one that pioneered these studies, and I also get to see the way he works from the inside out. And I will say that we are often in a position, and when we are in that position, we do our jobs, whether it be because we're editing manuscripts, or we're doing a peer review process, or we're working collaboratively. That time, then it is our job to say, well, this is the language that we use. Outside of that, I don't stop somebody mid-sentence because I lead by example. That's my intervention right there. I lead by example. So perhaps they're using language and I too engage in the conversation, but when they hear me, they'll hear that I'm using a different form of language. So I don't go out of my way. If my job is not to correct you, I don't do that because I don't want to shut somebody down from this conversation. I want them to engage with me, but I will also lead by example, and they will very clearly hear that I'm using an alternate form of language from what they are doing. So if it's not my position or my job to do that, which often it is, and I do, but I've got friends too. I've got parents too that use language that I want to be like, oh, okay. I lead by example. And don't you know, once in a while, I hear it come circle back around to me too. So that's the way I do it. That's the way I choose to do it.
Definitely that modeling, right?
Yeah, modeling. I do modeling. That's right. Until it's my job to address it specifically, I do my interventions through modeling. Yeah.
We have a question here from Brett. When would you say that the recovery movement started?
Ooh, some time ago. I mean, you could go back to the 1900s or so, and that's what the early 1900s or so. And that's when the formulation of mutual support groups, they came up, the formulation of support groups and various types of what you would call sober homes were there. And the thing is they were there and they were all alone, left to lead the way. The medical field did not show up. And so they carried that on their own until the medical field showed up. And I will tell you, even within medicine, part of what I've seen, anecdotally, is I've seen internal medicine sometimes more willing to show up than psychiatry. And that's a disorder that we diagnose in psychiatry. And I've seen internal medicine saying, all right, we're here to do this sometimes before I've seen psychiatry get familiar with their own disorder. So again, that's kind of an anecdotal type experience. But yeah, the recovery movement, William White is a recovery historian. And there's a reference that I can refer you to. Although I've had the privilege and the honor of him being a co-author of mine. William White is a recovery historian. He has built what I would consider to be the other main repository in this field. So the Recovery Research Institute and William White has a repository with history amongst the recovery field and about every subset or faucet that you could want to. He is the architect of the recovery language that we have in our field. In terms of the folks like us who have taken that recovery language and kind of gone off into research in many medical environments, particularly, people like my boss, John Kelly, I've heard him say on more than one occasion that William White was really kind of an architect of the recovery language in terms of us bringing it into the scientific, medical, and government communities. So yes, that recovery movement, they were carrying the weight when medicine did not. Absolutely. So.
Yes, I think we have a last question here from Jolynn. I think it was about the data that you had first shared in terms of people facing stigma around, what I think it was like, I can't even remember the specifics, but did that data also include relapse data? So
Got it. Yeah, great. Thank you. Great. Good question. So the relapse data, a lot of those studies are what they call cross-sectional. So they're done at one point in time. They're not done longitudinally. So we can see exactly how that happens. That's a place where we need more work. But let's talk about what we do know about relapse rates. This can, vary by primary substance, for example. So if you look at, and I often do a number of health equity lens. And so, for example, I have a study that's showing when it comes to relapse, and I'm going to say a formal relapse, meaning after a full sustained remission, 12 months of a full sustained remission, we know that some studies have found that when it comes to alcohol use disorder, there's about a 22% relapse rate. Okay. 22% experienced a relapse after a full sustained remission. And then the crux of sometimes where my work lies is that we also know that that relapse rate is higher for individuals who identify as Black. It was reported at 35% in some of the studies that were able to capture relapse rates. And so we have a bit of a health disparity there as well. But that's what I'll tell you about relapse rate. Great inquisitive question for the studies that are designed in such a way to capture those things. Thank you, Jalen.
I want to, just looking at time here, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an amazing, 1 hour that we spent with you. We could probably be here for many more hours asking you questions. But we will be sharing the recording on our website with everybody, so that will be available. And if you do have any other questions, please feel free to email us and we will try to direct you to the right person. Just as a reminder, we are doing these monthly, so please join us next month as well. You can register at that same link for our next in the series. Thank you so much, Dr. Corrie.
Oh, thank you for everybody. And I see all the comments in the chat. I will take them to heart next time I go to work on this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.